Al-Adi and Jetielmian, my friends, today we stand at a moment where the faintest glimmer of hope dares to pierce through the darkness of endless war. The call by former President Donald Trump for the fast implementation of a Gaza ceasefire deal is more than a headline. It is a test of our shared humanity. For far too long, the world has watched Gaza burn, innocent lives crushed beneath the rubble of politics and power. Each passing day without peace deepens the wounds of despair. Yet, when a voice, even one from the very center of global controversy, calls for an end to the killing, it is not a moment to scoff or politicize. It is a moment to act, because peace, when it knocks, does not care who opens the door, only that someone finally does. Peace begins when conscience awakes. It is the moment when the human heart refuses to accept the unbearable weight of suffering as normal, when silence becomes more painful than speaking the truth. Throughout history, every moral revolution has started not with armies or institutions, but with conscience, that quiet inner voice reminding us of what is right, even when the world has lost its way. The call for a Gaza ceasefire is not merely a political gesture or a diplomatic calculation. It is a moral awakening waiting to happen. It is a reminder that the measure of civilization is not found in skyscrapers or military strength, but in the compassion we extend to the most vulnerable among us. When conscience stirs, peace ceases to be an abstract dream and becomes a moral imperative. Look around at the world today. The images of devastation, the cries of mothers, the shattered lives of children who have never known a day without fear. If this does not awaken something within us, then we must ask ourselves, what have we become? A society that can scroll past tragedy without feeling is a society in danger of losing its soul. Yet the power to change that reality lies within each of us. Conscience is contagious. One voice that dares to say, "This must stop," inspires another and another until the whisper becomes a movement. That is how every great chapter of moral progress was written, by ordinary people whose conscience refused to sleep. Peace is not a transaction between governments, it is a transformation within hearts. When Trump calls for the fast implementation of a Gaza ceasefire, the world must not respond with skepticism or cynicism, but with the maturity to recognize that even unlikely voices can speak necessary truths. The real question is not who calls for peace, but whether we are ready to answer. The awakening of conscience often comes from unexpected places, and it demands humility, the humility to listen, to change, to act before it is too late. The history of peace is the history of humanity choosing conscience over convenience. Every war begins with the death of empathy, and every peace begins with its rebirth. To awaken conscience is to restore the ability to see ourselves in the suffering of others. The tears of a mother in Gaza are not foreign, they are the universal language of pain. The rubble of a bombed hospital is not distant. It is the mirror of our collective failure. Once we truly see that, indifference becomes impossible. Conscience turns compassion into motion, and motion into change. And that change, once ignited, spreads faster than any weapon ever could. The awakening of conscience is not passive, it is powerful. It calls for action, for leaders to lay down pride, for citizens to demand justice, for nations to remember that power without empathy is destruction disguised as strategy. When conscience awakens, it pierces through the noise of propaganda, the arrogance of politics, and the apathy of distance. It whispers to every human being enough. Enough of the killing, enough of the hatred, enough of pretending that peace is too complicated to achieve. The truth is simple. Peace begins the moment we choose to care. There is a profound beauty in that awakening. It reminds us that even in the darkest hours of history, light can emerge from within us. Conscience is the heartbeat of peace, steady, quiet, but unstoppable once awakened. And when enough hearts begin to beat in unison, walls crumble, leaders listen, and humanity remembers what it means to be whole again. That is the power of moral awakening. It turns despair into determination and tragedy into transformation. The call for a ceasefire in Gaza is more than a demand for silence of guns. It is a plea for the awakening of conscience in every one of us. Because only when our conscience rises does peace truly begin to walk among us. A ceasefire is not the end. It is the beginning of courage. It is that fragile moment when nations, after years of anger and vengeance, finally dare to look beyond the smoke of destruction and ask themselves, what now? It takes immense bravery to stop fighting because war feeds on pride, fear, and the illusion of strength. To choose peace in such a world is not weakness. It is the highest form of moral and political courage. The decision to implement a Gaza ceasefire swiftly is not about silencing the guns. It is about daring to believe that humanity is capable of healing after unimaginable pain. It is about transforming the noise of violence into the dialogue of rebuilding. Every ceasefire in history begins with doubt. Skeptics call it temporary, critics call it nervy, and cynics call it impossible. Yet every meaningful peace we have ever known was once dismissed in exactly the same way. The courage to cease fire is not found in those who can destroy, but in those who can forgive. It is far easier to press a trigger than to extend a hand, far easier to hate than to heal. But the leaders who change the course of history are the ones who find strength in restraint, not aggression. When a leader, any leader, calls for a fast implementation of a ceasefire, they are not just making a political statement. They are making a moral stand against the inertia of violence. True courage is not in domination, but in reconciliation. The bombs may fall for weeks, but the emotional ruins of war last for generations. Children who grow up under fire do not forget. They carry the trauma in their hearts, passing it to their children and grandchildren. To end the violence is not just to stop the bloodshed, it is to the inheritance of hate. That is what courage looks like. It is the courage to say that our moral responsibility to the future is greater than our loyalty to the past. It is the courage to imagine Gaza not as a battleground, but as a community of families, schools, and dreams waiting to be rebuilt. Courage, in this sense, is not a moment, it is a process. It is what happens after the ceasefire is signed, when the world must rebuild not only infrastructure, but trust. It means facing uncomfortable truths, the mistakes, the miscalculations, the human cost of pride. It means leaders daring to admit that the real enemy was never the people on the other side of the border, but the cycle of vengeance that blinds both sides. Every brick after war is an act of courage. Every treaty signed an act of defiance against despair. Peace is not built in one stroke. It is crafted day by those who choose to believe that coexistence is still possible. The Gaza ceasefire, if implemented swiftly and sincerely, could become one of those rare historical turning points when humanity decides that enough is enough. The courage needed now is not military. It is moral. It is the courage of dialogue, of empathy, of truth-telling. It requires the world's leaders to move beyond rhetoric and into action, to understand that every day of delay is another day of mourning for mothers and fathers who have already lost too much. The real measure of leadership is not in how much land one can control, but in how much suffering one can prevent. Every generation is offered a choice to continue the wars of the past or to build the peace of the future. And that choice is never easy, because peace demands humility and patience in a world addicted to force and speed. But courage begins when fear ends, and fear ends when conscience awakens. To stop fighting, to negotiate, to rebuild, these are acts of profound strength. When nations lay down their weapons, they are not surrendering, they are ascending. They are proving that moral conviction can triumph over political calculation, and that humanity's greatest victory will always be found not in conquest, but in compassion. A ceasefire, therefore, is not a pause in courage. It is where courage truly begins. The value of every human life is equal, or civilization falls. This truth lies at the very core of our moral existence, yet it is the one principle humanity violates most often. The tragedy of Gaza is not just a regional crisis. It is a mirror reflecting how far we have drifted from that fundamental idea. When we begin to weigh human worth according to nationality, religion, or race, we lose the essence of civilization itself. The moment a child's life in Gaza is seen as less valuable than a child's life in New York or London, we have not only failed politically, we have failed morally. The test of our humanity is never how we treat our allies, but how we treat those we have been taught to see as the other. It is easy to speak of justice in abstract terms, but the real test comes when compassion demands sacrifice. Equal worth is not a slogan, it is a moral law that requires action. It demands that nations act not out of interest, but out of conscience. If the world can rush aid to rebuild after earthquakes or hurricanes, it must also have the moral will to rebuild after human-made disasters of war. Every bomb that falls on Gaza shatters more than concrete. It fractures the moral foundation of the global order. When one life is deemed expendable, all life becomes cheaper. That is the law of moral decay, and history has shown its consequences again and again. The faces of Gaza's children tell the story more powerfully than any statistic. Their eyes carry a mix of innocence and exhaustion. A look that asks the world a question it does not want to answer: why is our pain invisible? It is a question every conscience must confront, because until we can look their suffering and feel the same urgency we would feel for our own, peace will remain an illusion. Empathy is not weakness. It is a civilization's highest form of intelligence. It is what separates compassion from apathy, moral clarity from political expediency. The ability to feel for another human being, regardless of borders, is the most revolutionary act of our time. The equality of human life is not a Western or Eastern idea. It is a universal truth written into the very fabric of moral reason. Every culture, every faith, every philosophy has taught this in one form or another. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. None of you truly believes until you wish for your brother what you wish for yourself. These are not ancient relics. They are living moral codes that should guide nations as much as they guide individuals. Yet, when bombs fall and leaders justify it as necessary, humanity betrays its own creed. True leadership begins when we can see beyond tribe and territory and recognize the human being beneath the political label. The Gaza conflict has become more than a geopolitical struggle. It is a moral reckoning. It forces the world to choose between the convenience of silence and the courage of equality. To say every life matters equally is not to take a political side. It is to take the side of humanity itself. The idea that one nation's security requires another people's suffering is not strategy. It is moral bankruptcy. Real security is born from justice, not domination. The future will not belong to those who conquer through fear, but to those who protect through fairness. When we strip away ideology and pride, what remains is a simple truth: every life has the same heartbeat, the same right to safety, the same longing for dignity. A ceasefire in Gaza is not just a political necessity, it is a moral correction. It is the world's chance to say, with action not words, that no child should die for the ambitions of men, because the true measure of a civilization is not how it treats its powerful, but how it protects its powerless. And if we fail to uphold that, we will wake up one day to find that civilization did not fall by force. It eroded quietly the moment we forgot that every human life was meant to be equal. Diplomacy is the highest form of strength. It is the art of transforming conflict into cooperation, hostility into understanding, and fear into reason. In a world consumed by arrogance and aggression, diplomacy stands as the quiet courage that builds when others destroy. It is the strength that does not roar, but resonates, the power that does not dominate, but endures. The call for a fast implementation of a Gaza ceasefire is not just a plea for peace, it is a call to rediscover the true essence of leadership, the ability to solve through dialogue what war has only worsened. Real strength is not proven by how many enemies one can defeat, but by how many lives one can save through wisdom. The illusion of modern power is that violence can deliver security. Yet history teaches the opposite. Every empire that glorified force eventually collapsed under its own brutality. Weapons can silence enemies, but they cannot silence truth. Bombs can destroy buildings, but never the will of a people. Diplomacy, on the other hand, is the act of seeing the humanity across the table, even when emotions run raw. It demands a kind of courage that soldiers alone cannot provide. The courage to listen, to compromise, to accept that peace is not about victory, but coexistence. The leaders who embrace this truth are remembered not for their conquests, but for their compassion. When a nation chooses diplomacy over destruction, it is not showing weakness, it is demonstrating the deepest kind of power, the moral authority that commands respect without instilling fear. The world admires the strength of those who can walk away from vengeance, who can choose the pen instead of the sword. It takes enormous restraint to negotiate when blood has been spilled, yet that restraint is what defines true statesmanship. The greatest test of leadership is not managing conflict, but ending it. The diplomats who worked tirelessly to end the Cold War, to bring peace to Northern Ireland, to heal post-apartheid South Africa, they were not warriors in uniform, but warriors of conscience. The Gaza conflict demands such warriors now. It demands diplomats who understand that peace is not an event, but a process, not a declaration, but a commitment. It requires the recognition that no side can win through annihilation, because the cost of such victory is the loss of humanity itself. In every negotiation, there comes a moment when pride must give way to purpose. That moment defines nations. The decision to pursue diplomacy, to prioritize dialogue over domination, is not just a strategic choice, but a moral awakening. It is the realization that the true power of a nation is not measured by its military might, but by its capacity to inspire trust and cooperation. Diplomacy is, at its core, the language of civilization. It is how humanity rises above its primitive instincts and embraces its higher reasoning. It is the discipline of turning chaos into structure, emotion into logic, and rage into resolution. In Gaza's case, diplomacy must become more than an afterthought. It must be the foundation of the future. Because every missile that flies is a failure of dialogue. Every child lost is a consequence of words left unsaid. The time for moral maturity has come. The ceasefire must not only stop the bloodshed, but ignite a long-term diplomatic effort built on empathy, justice, and shared security. Those who champion diplomacy must do so with the courage of conviction, because the voices of peace are often drowned out by the drums of war. Yet history remembers those who dared to speak when silence was convenient. It remembers the negotiators, the visionaries, the architects of peace who believed that even the most entrenched enemies could find common ground. The future belongs to such visionaries, to those who understand that the greatest power is not to destroy, but to unite. True strength lies not in domination, but in the discipline of dialogue. When humanity finally understands that peace will no longer be a dream, it will be the natural outcome of wisdom. The future belongs to the builders, not the destroyers. History does not glorify those who reduced cities to rubble or left generations in despair. It remembers those who had the vision to rebuild when the world had lost hope. Destruction is easy. It takes only a moment, a missile, a decision born of anger or fear. But building requires imagination, patience, and courage. It demands a strength of spirit far greater than any weapon can deliver. In the ruins of Gaza, amid the shattered glass and broken hearts, lies the opportunity to begin again. The true measure of a nation, of a people, is not in how fiercely they can fight, but in how determinedly they can rebuild a life worth living after the fighting ends. The destroyers will always claim to act in the name of security, revenge, or justice, but their legacy is written in ashes. Builders, on the other hand, create legacies that outlive empires. They are the ones who take the pain of loss and turn it into the foundation for renewal. When peace comes to Gaza, it will not be through those who unleashed fire from the skies, but through those who pick up the first stone to rebuild a home, a school, a hospital, a future. That act, the rebuilding of life itself, is the purest expression of human defiance. It is saying to the world, you tried to break us, but we will rise. To build after destruction requires vision. It means looking at chaos and seeing potential, looking at hatred and seeing humanity. Builders are not naive dreamers. They are realists who understand that the cost of endless destruction is too high for any civilization to bear. They know that prosperity and stability do not grow out of rubble. They grow out of education, cooperation, and justice. The rebuilding of Gaza, therefore, must not be limited to concrete and steel. It must include the rebuilding of trust, dignity, and hope. A ceasefire may stop the bombs, but only the builders can stop the despair. The future belongs to those who dare to see beauty where others see ruin. Every generation inherits a choice to continue the cycle of destruction or to become the architects of renewal. The builders of history, those who lifted Europe after 2 world wars, who reconciled divided nations, who transformed ruins into cities of life, were not the loudest voices but the most steadfast hearts. They understood that progress is not born from hate, but from the relentless pursuit of peace. Gaza's future depends on such visionaries today, on those willing to replace the language of war with the language of healing. True builders are not limited by borders or ideology. They exist in every nation, in every community, in every heart that refuses to surrender to despair. They are teachers who continue to educate amid ruins, doctors who heal despite shortages, children who draw pictures of peace on the walls of broken homes. They embody the most profound truth of human existence, that creation is stronger than destruction. Every small act of rebuilding, every moment of kindness, every step toward reconciliation chips away at the darkness of violence. That is the real revolution, the transformation of pain into progress. When the world finally turns away from destruction and toward construction, when it values builders over bombers, it will rediscover its humanity. The leaders who will shape the next century will not be those who commanded armies, but those who built bridges. The nations that thrive will not be those who conquered through fear, but those who invested in peace, education, and opportunity. Building is the language of hope. Destruction is the dialect of despair. The future will belong to those who choose the harder, nobler path to create, to heal, to rebuild. In every era, civilization moves forward because a few refused to destroy and dared instead to build a world that lasts. Humanity's greatest battle is not between nations, but within ourselves. It is the invisible struggle that takes place in the quiet corners of the human heart, the war between compassion and cruelty, between the impulse to destroy and the instinct to heal. Every act of violence, every moment of hatred, is born not from strength, but from the failure to win that inner war. The tragedy of Gaza is not just a story of political collapse. It is a mirror reflecting our collective inability to master the most essential challenge of being human, to rise above vengeance, ego, and fear. The bombs may fall in one place, but the moral consequences fall on us all. The future of civilization depends on whether humanity can conquer the darkness within before it consumes the world outside. The wars of our time are fought with missiles and rhetoric, but their origins lie in emotions, in prejudice, insecurity, and pride. The battle within is fought every time a leader chooses rage over reason, every time a citizen chooses indifference over empathy. That is where the real front line lies. Winning this internal war requires moral courage, the kind that cannot be measured in armies or budgets. It is the courage to listen when it is easier to shout, to forgive when it is easier to hate, and to seek justice without falling into revenge. The strongest person is not the one who dominates others, but the one who masters themselves. When humanity learns to govern its own anger, peace will cease to be a dream. It will become our default condition. From the smallest quarrel to the greatest war begins with a failure of empathy. We dehumanize those we fear until we convince ourselves that their suffering is justified. But to see the face of an enemy and still recognize the same humanity, that is the ultimate victory. The soldiers of peace are not armed with weapons, they are armed with understanding. To win the battle within, we must rediscover that shared humanity that transcends politics, religion, and geography. The child in Gaza, the mother in Israel, the family watching from afar. They all belong to the same human story. The division between us and them is an illusion, and the longer we believe in it, the more we lose of ourselves. It takes greater strength to hold compassion in the face of anger than to unleash fury in the name of justice. That is the test of true civilization, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of conscience. Every person, every nation is confronted with this moral crossroad. Do we act from fear or from faith in one another? Do we choose to perpetuate pain or to end it? The world will change the moment more people answer those questions with courage instead of comfort. Peace will never be achieved through domination. It will be born through transformation. And that transformation must begin in the human heart before it can manifest in the world. The greatest leaders of history understood this inner battle. Gandhi fought it. Mandela won it. They both knew that freedom and forgiveness are not opposites. They are partners. They proved that the only way to end the war outside is to end the war within. Gaza's pain, therefore, is not just a geopolitical crisis, it is a moral alarm. It calls on every one of us to rise to our higher nature, to refuse to be prisoners of hate, and to believe that empathy can be stronger than anger. The real revolution is not fought on battlefields, but in the human spirit. It is the quiet rebellion against indifference, the insistence that love can outlast hate. If humanity can win this invisible war, if we can master our emotions as we have mastered technology, then the world will finally reflect the best of who we are. The moment we conquer the hatred within, the guns outside will have no reason to fire, and in that triumph, not of armies but of hearts, the story of peace will finally begin to write itself.